$3. That's all Silas Ward had left in his pocket. 3 crumpled, sweat-stained bills that smelled of dust and horses. He heard the auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty saw blade, grating and ugly. And with those $3, Silas was about to buy a world of trouble. He was about to buy something that would unravel everything he thought he knew about this dusty little town, about the men who ran it, and about the very nature of good and evil. The main street of Copper Falls was a chaotic mess, just like every Saturday. Ranchers haggled over the price of cattle, their voices booming. Miners, their faces permanently stained with grime, argued about the quality of new equipment. Drifters with hollow eyes leaned against posts, watching, always watching. Silas had only come to town for supplies. Rope for his well, coffee to get him through the cold nights, maybe some bacon if the prices were fair. He was a simple man with simple needs, or so he thought. His weathered hands, cracked and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, held the reins of his horse. He guided the animal through the throng, his eyes scanning the makeshift stalls. That's when he heard it. Not the usual low hum of commerce, but something different. A sharp, hungry sound. The sound of a crowd turning into a pack of wolves. It was coming from the old grain warehouse at the edge of town. Men were pushing and shoving to get a better look, their voices a low, excited growl. Silas had seen auctions his whole life, but this one felt wrong. It felt sick. An unnatural energy pulsed from that crowd, a dark current that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He dismounted, tying his horse to a hitching post, and moved closer. His boots crunched on the dry, unforgiving earth. He slipped through the gaps between broad shoulders and sweat-stained hats, inching his way toward the center of the commotion. And then he saw her. On a wooden crate, like a piece of livestock waiting for the slaughter, stood a young Chinese girl. She couldn't have been more than a child. Her black hair hung in matted, greasy strands around a face that was thin and pale with terror. Her clothes were nothing more than rags, torn and filthy, but it was her eyes that hit Silas like a punch to the gut. They were wide and dark, and in their depths he saw a fear so profound, so absolute, it seemed to suck all the air out of his lungs. She wasn't just scared, she was broken. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Barlow, with a stained vest and a rotten-toothed grin, was barking out numbers. He wasn't looking at her as a person. None of them were. They were looking at her like she was a new shovel or a young mare. A tool, a thing, something to be used, abused, and eventually discarded. $2, 50, a voice called out. Silas's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He recognized the men in the crowd. Cord Jennings, the powerful ranch owner who worked his men into the ground. Frank Morrison, the mine foreman known for his brutal cruelty. Men who saw people as nothing more than assets or obstacles. A man in a sharp black coat, a stranger Silas had never seen before, raised a single gloved finger. $3.00. The stranger's voice was cold and clipped. He wasn't looking at the girl with lust or greed like the others. He was looking at her with something else, something calculating, like he was acquiring a specific piece for a much larger, more complicated machine. Barlow's gavel was already rising, his greasy smile widening. He knew a high roller when he saw one. The bidding was about to jump, to spiral out of the reach of common men. That's when Silas heard a voice cut through the noise. A rough, gravelly voice he barely recognized as his own. $3. $50. The words flew out of his mouth before his brain could snatch them back. A reckless, stupid impulse born from the sight of those terrified eyes. Every single head in the crowd swiveled to face him. The loud chatter died instantly, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. The girl's eyes, which had been staring at the dusty ground, snapped up and locked onto his. For a single, breathless moment, the world stopped. Barlow, the auctioneer, looked utterly bewildered. This wasn't part of the script. Silas Ward, the quiet hermit from the hills, never bid on anything. He was a ghost in this town, a man who kept to himself, a man who wanted no trouble. But a bid was a bid, and greed always wins over confusion. Going once, Barlow stammered, his eyes darting between Silas and the man in the black coat. Going twice? The stranger in black simply lowered his hand and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He looked at Silas not with anger, but with a strange, chilling curiosity, as if Silas was an unexpected bug he'd just found crawling across his dinner plate. The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive crack. It sounded like a bone snapping, and in that instant, a cold, sickening wave of dread washed over Silas. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. But the victory felt like poison, because now he remembered the three crumpled bills in his pocket. He had bid $3.50, and he only had $3. Every eye in that crowd was now drilling into him. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by suspicion and ridicule. The girl was still staring at him, but the flicker of hope in her eyes was being rapidly extinguished by a new, more personal fear. Fear of him. Fear of the man who had just bought her and now stood there frozen, a fool who couldn't even pay. The crowd started to murmur. The wolves were getting restless. He could feel their judgment, their contempt. Barlow cleared his throat, a low, impatient rumble. He stretched out a grimy, expectant hand. $3.50, Ward. The money he didn't have. His mind was a frantic blur as his hand dove into his pocket. His fingers closed around the three familiar, worn-out bills. Sweat beaded on his forehead, cold and slick despite the cool morning air. Behind him, a man chuckled, a low, dark sound. The story was already forming, spreading through the crowd like a contagion. The old hermit from the hills had finally lost his mind, bitten off more than he could chew. He was about to be humiliated, or worse. In a town like this, failing to pay could be seen as a grave insult. Then he felt a firm hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Marshall Tucker standing beside him, his face as weathered and unreadable as an old stone monument. Tucker was a man Silas had known since they were boys, a man who saw everything and said little. "You short, Silas?" Tucker's voice was a low whisper, meant only for him. Before Silas could even form a response, Tucker pressed something small and metallic into his palm. 2 heavy quarters, warm from the marshal's pocket. "Pay the man," Tucker said, his face giving nothing away. With a hand that was steadier than he felt, Silas unfolded his own $3 and added the marshal's 50 cents. He placed the money in Barlow's outstretched palm. The auctioneer snatched the bills and coins. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. He counted it once, then twice. Finally, with a disgruntled grunt, he jerked his head toward the girl on the crate. "She's yours. Got papers if you want 'em." He held out a crude bill of sale, the ink still wet and smudged. Papers, like she was a sack of grain or a piece of farm equipment. The thought made Silas's stomach churn. He stared at the document, the ugly black marks on the cheap paper that claimed to give one human being ownership over another. Then he looked back at the girl. She was trembling, a slight, continuous shiver that ran through her small frame. Her hands were clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles were white. She was trying to make herself invisible. The crowd, their entertainment over, was already starting to disperse. They were moving on to the next auction. Cattle this time. Something normal. Something they understood. Something that didn't stir up the uncomfortable questions this auction had. Silas took the paper, folded it without reading it, and shoved it deep into his jacket pocket. It felt like a cancerous lump against his chest. He approached the girl slowly, gently, the way he would approach a spooked colt. He kept his hands open and visible. As he got closer, he could see the angry purple and yellow bruises that marred the skin on her arms. He saw the way she flinched when his shadow fell across her. This child had known nothing but pain. From the look of it, she'd known it from many different people. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to crowd her. He held out his hand, palm up. Not a command, but an offering. "My name's Silas," he said, his voice quiet and low. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a coiled snake. Her eyes darted from his face to his hand and back again, searching for the trick, the trap. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft, so fragile, it was like the sound of a falling leaf. "Min." He almost missed it. Her English was broken, heavily accented, but the word was clear enough. A name, a piece of herself she still owned. Silas nodded and slowly lowered his hand. "Min, that's a good name." He looked around at the last of the dispersing crowd, at the hostile, curious stares they were still getting. Then he looked back at her. Are you hungry? The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. A flicker of disbelief crossed her face. She gave a single quick nod, as if she was afraid he might take the offer back. There's a place across the street, Silas said, gesturing toward the restaurant. We'll get you some food. But as they started to walk, Silas felt the weight of the town's eyes on them. He heard the whispers, the snickers, a white rancher walking side by side with a Chinese girl he'd just bought at a back alley auction. In Copper Falls, that meant only one thing, and the trouble he thought he'd dodge was only just beginning. When they reached the restaurant door, it swung open before they could touch it. The owner, a barrel-chested man named Garrett with a thick mustache and mean little eyes, stepped out to block their path. We don't serve her kind in here, Ward, Garrett said, his arms crossed over his stained apron. His eyes flicked to Min with a look of pure, undisguised disgust. You'll have to find somewhere else. He then added with a smirk, maybe the alley behind Chen's laundry. That's where they belong. Silas felt something cold and hard settle in his gut. He had been a fool to think this would be simple. He'd bought the girl to save her, but what if he'd only dragged her from one hell into another? He could see the resignation creeping back into Min's eyes, the light he had briefly seen there dimming once again. She expected this. She expected cruelty. He could just walk away, take Min and find some scraps of food elsewhere, keep the peace like he always did. But he looked at Garrett's smug face, at the self-satisfied cruelty in his eyes, and a different kind of feeling began to burn in his chest, a hot, familiar anger he hadn't felt in years. He stepped closer to the restaurant owner, close enough that Garrett had to look up at him. Her money's as good as anyone's, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. And since I'm paying, I reckon that makes it my money. Garrett didn't budge. He was enjoying this. Don't matter whose money it is. I don't serve Chinamen in my establishment. It's bad for business. He glanced around at the small crowd of onlookers that was starting to gather, drawn by the scent of confrontation. You understand, Silas. Nothing personal. But it felt deeply personal. Standing there with Min just behind him, Silas could feel her shrinking, trying to pull away, trying to become invisible again. The same look he'd seen on the auction block. Then I guess we'll eat somewhere else, Silas said, making a move to turn away. He wasn't a fighter, not anymore, but Garrett's next words stopped him cold. Might want to be careful, Ward. The owner's voice was laced with a smug, threatening tone. People are already talking, wondering what a lonely old rancher plans to do with a young girl like that. Garrett's smile was ugly, predatory. Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea about your intentions. The threat was as clear as a gunshot. In a town this small, a man's reputation was all he had, and a reputation could be shredded by whispers, by ugly assumptions, especially when it involved a man like Silas and a girl like Min. His fists clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. He could feel himself teetering on the edge of a decision that would lead to violence. Just then, a calm voice cut through the tension. Problem here, gentlemen? Marshall Tucker had appeared beside them, moving with the quiet efficiency of a shadow. His hand rested casually, almost lazily, on the butt of his pistol, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Because if there is, Tucker continued, his gaze flicking from Garrett to Silas, maybe we should all take a walk down to my office and discuss it. Garrett's bluster instantly deflated. The last thing he wanted was official involvement. No problem, Marshal. No problem at all. Just explaining the house rules to Mr. Ward here. Tucker nodded slowly, his eyes unblinking. House rules. I see. He looked at Silas, then his gaze softened for a moment as he looked at Min, who was watching the exchange with wide, terrified eyes. Well, as it happens, Tucker said, turning his attention back to Garrett, I know a place that serves excellent food to anyone with coin to pay for it. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Her dining room is open to the public. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, wrapped in the thin veil of politeness. Silas gave a curt nod and gently gestured for Min to follow him. As they walked away, he could hear Garrett muttering under his breath, but the man was smart enough not to say anything loud enough for the marshal to hear. The boarding house was only 2 blocks away, but it felt like the longest, most grueling walk of Silas's life. Every single person they passed stopped and stared, some with open curiosity, others with thinly veiled hostility. The whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. Word of the auction was spreading like wildfire. When they reached Mrs. Henderson's, a kindly, silver-haired woman in her 60s, she took one look at Min's bruised face and haunted eyes, and her expression immediately softened with compassion. "That poor child looks half-starved," she clucked, bustling them inside. "You sit right down. I'll fix her up something proper." But as they sat at a small, secluded table in the corner, Silas noticed the other patrons. They weren't hostile like Garrett, but they were whispering, pointing, their curiosity a palpable force in the room. And through the front window, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Small groups of men were gathering on the street outside. They weren't just curious passers-by. They were standing together, talking in low, angry tones, and pointing directly at the boarding house. The kind of groups that meant trouble wasn't just coming. It was already here. Mrs. Henderson placed a steaming plate of beef stew and a thick slice of fresh baked bread in front of Min. The girl stared at it as if she couldn't believe it was real. Her small hands trembled as she picked up the spoon. For a moment, Silas thought she was going to cry. He wondered, with a sharp pang in his chest, when the last time was that someone had shown her such a simple kindness. She ate slowly at first, cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Then, as the warmth of the food spread through her, she ate faster, with a desperate hunger that spoke of days, maybe weeks, of starvation. Silas watched her, the knot in his stomach tightening. How long had she been treated like this? How long had this child been nothing more than a commodity to be starved and beaten and sold? The dining room had grown unnervingly quiet. The other patrons finished their meals with hurried, awkward movements and left, casting nervous glances in their direction. Even the kind Mrs. Henderson seemed on edge, her usual cheerful bustling replaced by a tense, worried energy. Through the window, Silas could see the crowd outside had grown larger, more menacing. Their faces were no longer just curious. They were hard and angry. "Silas!" Min's voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. She had stopped eating and was looking at him, her dark eyes searching his face. He could see she was trying to piece something together, trying to understand the man who had inexplicably saved her. "Why you help me?" It was a fair question, the same question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd opened his foolish mouth at that auction. Why had he done it? He was a man who avoided trouble at all costs. He'd come to town for rope and coffee, and instead he'd bought a human being with money he didn't even have, turning the entire town against him in the process. It made no sense. "Don't know," he answered, and it was the honest truth. Just seemed like the right thing to do. She studied his face intently, as if trying to read the secrets written in his wrinkles. "Other men," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "they want different things, bad things." That cold, hard anger settled in his chest again. Of course they did. To the men at that auction, she wasn't a person with a name and a history and a soul. She was just a thing, a body to be used for their pleasure or their profit. "I'm not like other men," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. Before Min could respond, the front door of the boarding house burst open with a violent crash. 3 men strode in, and the air in the room instantly turned to ice. Silas recognized them immediately. Cord Jennings, the owner of the biggest ranch in the territory, his face red and swollen with fury. His son, Blake, a young man with a mean, cruel streak and eyes as cold as a snake's. And Frank Morrison, the mine foreman. They weren't here for dinner. Cord's eyes scanned the room, landing on Silas and Min with the force of a physical blow. He stalked over to their table, his heavy boots thudding on the wooden floor. "Ward," Cord boomed, his voice dripping with venom. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Silas carefully placed his coffee cup back on its saucer. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Eating dinner, Cord. You got a problem with that?" "My problem," Cord snarled, his voice rising, "is that you just made every decent man in this town look like a fool. Bidding on a Chinese girl like she's worth something. You're upsetting the natural order of things." The words hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Mrs. Henderson gasped from behind the counter. Min's face went deathly pale, but to Silas's surprise, she didn't shrink away. She sat up straighter, her small chin lifted in a silent act of defiance. Silas rose slowly from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. He was a tall man, and he made sure to use every inch of his height. "Watch your mouth, Jennings." Blake, always spoiling for a fight, stepped forward, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Or what, old man?" he sneered. "You gonna fight all of us? Over some piece of yellow-skinned trash? What would you do in this situation? Back down to protect the girl from more trouble? Or stand your ground and risk a bloodbath right here in this dining room? Let me know in the comments below, because what Silas did next, well, it was the point of no return. "I reckon," Silas said, his voice deceptively calm, "a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin." Frank Morrison let out a short, harsh laugh. "You've gone soft in the head, Ward. Been alone on that ranch of yours for too long." His eyes flicked to Min with open disgust. "Either way, this ends now. Hand her over." The tension in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Blake's fingers were twitching over his gun, an eager, predatory gleam in his eyes. He'd been looking for an excuse to challenge someone for weeks, and here was Silas, old, alone, and outnumbered. But before any steel could be drawn, a familiar, steady presence filled the doorway. Marshall Tucker stepped into the room, his boots ringing with authority on the wooden floor. He took in the scene at a glance. Jennings and his men poised to attack, Silas standing his ground, and the terrified girl caught in the middle. "Gentlemen," Tucker said, his voice as calm as a summer morning, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "I certainly hope we're not about to cause trouble in Mrs. Henderson's fine establishment." Cord Jennings whirled around to face the marshal, his face still flushed with rage. "Tucker, this is none of your concern. Ward has brought shame on this entire town with his purchase." Tucker's eyes flicked to Min, who was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Then he looked back at Cord. "Last I checked, Cord, what a man does with his own money is his own business. As long as it's legal, of course." "Legal?" Blake spat, his voice filled with contempt. "What's legal about buying a human being like she's a side of beef?" "Well now," Tucker said slowly, drawing out the words, "that is an interesting question." He took a step further into the room, and every man there felt the shift in power. "See, I've been doing some thinking about that auction this morning, and I can't for the life of me figure out where exactly those fellas who were selling the young lady got the legal right to do so." The room went dead silent. Silas watched as the full implication of Tucker's words sank into the thick skulls of Jennings and his men. If the auctioneers didn't have legal ownership of Min, then the entire sale was illegal, which meant that every single man who had placed a bid was an accomplice to a very serious crime. Frank Morrison cleared his throat, a nervous, raspy sound. "Now hold on, Marshal. We were just, that is, we thought." "You thought you could buy a human being as if she were a piece of livestock," Tucker finished for him, his voice hardening. "And now you're upset because Silas here had the decency to outbid you?" He stepped closer to the three men, his presence looming over them. "It makes a man wonder. What exactly were your intentions for her?" Cord's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You can't seriously be taking his side in this." "I'm not taking anyone's side, Cord," Tucker said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "I am upholding the law, and I'm just pointing out that if any crime was committed here today, it wasn't by Silas Ward." His hand came to rest, not casually this time, on the handle of his gun. "Now I suggest you gentlemen take your leave, before I start asking more pointed questions about who knew what and when." Blake looked like he wanted to argue, like his pride was stinging too much to back down. But his father, for all his bluster, was no fool. He knew when he was beaten. Cord grabbed his son's arm with a grip of iron. "Come on," Cord muttered through clenched teeth. He shot a look at Silas, a look filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over, Ward." After they stomped out, the dining room felt like it could finally breathe again. Mrs. Henderson let out a long, shaky sigh and began clearing tables with frantic, nervous energy. Tucker pulled up a chair and sat down across from Silas and Min. He leaned forward, his voice low. "They're not wrong about one thing," he said quietly. "This isn't over. Word's spreading, and not everyone in this town is going to see things the way I do." He looked at Min, and a hint of kindness crept into his stern eyes. "You have somewhere safe to take her?" Silas nodded. "My ranch. It's about 10 miles out, isolated." "Good," Tucker said. "Get her there before dark." He leaned in even closer, his expression grim. "But Silas, you need to understand something. What you did today, it wasn't just about this girl. You challenged men like Core Jennings. You disrupted their world. They're going to see it as a personal attack. They'll want to hurt you, and they'll want to hurt her just to prove a point." As if on cue, Silas glanced out the window. The crowd hadn't dispersed. In fact, it had grown even larger. Their voices were louder now, angrier, and several of them were pointing, not at the front door, but around the sides of the building. They were looking for another way in. The mob was no longer just watching. It was getting ready to act. The low murmur from the street was escalating into an ugly roar. Silas could now make out individual words through the glass. Words like lesson and trespasser and rail. They were talking about running men out of town on a rail, a brutal, humiliating punishment that could easily turn deadly. Tucker stood and walked to the window, his face a grim mask. "There's about 20 of them out there now, maybe more. Some I recognize, some I don't." He turned back to Silas, his hand resting on his gun. "You got another way out of here?" Mrs. Henderson looked up from the table she was frantically wiping, her face pale. "There's a back door, through the kitchen. It leads to the alley behind the mercantile." Silas helped Min to her feet. She was trembling again, the warmth from the meal long gone, replaced by the chilling reality of the mob outside. "We need to get to my horse," Silas said to Tucker. "Your horse is tied up right in front of that crowd," Tucker pointed out grimly. "The second you step out onto the main street, they'll be on you." That's when Mrs. Henderson spoke up again, her voice shaky but determined. "My husband, he kept an old wagon behind the boarding house. A horse, too. An old mare. She's not much to look at, but she's steady. She'll get you where you need to go." The old woman was wringing her hands in her apron, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I can't stand by and see that poor child treated this way." A wave of gratitude washed over Silas. In a town that had turned its back on them, this one woman was willing to risk everything. "I'll make sure it gets back to you, ma'am. I promise." "Don't you worry about that now," she said, already moving toward the kitchen. "You just get her somewhere safe." They moved quickly, slipping through the warm, fragrant kitchen and out the back door into the cool evening air. The alley was deserted, but the angry shouts of the mob echoed eerily between the tall wooden buildings. Mrs. Henderson led them to a small, rickety stable where an old gray mare stood patiently hitched to a weather-beaten buckboard wagon. As Silas helped Min climb into the wagon bed, she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "What if they follow?" she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "What if they come to your home?" It was the question he'd been desperately trying to ignore. His ranch was isolated, a fortress of solitude. But that isolation could just as easily become a trap. If trouble came calling that far out, there would be no Marshall Tucker, no one to help, just him, a scared girl, and whatever guns he had on hand. "We'll face that when we get there," he said, trying to project a confidence he was far from feeling. Tucker appeared at the mouth of the alley, his expression tense. "They're starting to spread out. Looking for you. You need to go, now." Silas climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. The old mare wasn't much to look at, her coat dull and her frame bony, but her eyes were alert and intelligent. There was still a fire in her. She would do. He guided the wagon out of the alley and onto a quiet side street. From there, he could see the main part of the mob still gathered in a furious cluster in front of the boarding house. But smaller groups were breaking off, fanning out through the town. He saw Blake Jennings, his face a mask of rage, leading one of them down a street that would cut them off. They had made it 3 blocks when Silas heard the sound he had been dreading. Hoofbeats, coming up fast behind them. He glanced over his shoulder and saw 5 riders emerge from between 2 buildings, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Blake was in the lead, and when he saw the wagon, he let out a triumphant, bloodthirsty yell that carried across the street. "There they are. Don't let them get away." Silas snapped the reins, urging the old mare into a faster pace. But the wagon was heavy and the horse was old. The riders were closing the distance with terrifying speed. Min pressed herself flat against the wagon bed, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough wooden sides. The edge of town was still a half-mile away. They weren't going to make it. Silas's mind raced, desperately searching for an option, any option. He could try to outrun them, but that was a losing game. He could stop and try to reason with them, but one look at Blake's face told him that reason had left the building. That's when he heard the sharp crack of a pistol. The bullet whizzed past his ear, so close he felt the heat of it, and splintered the wooden seat right beside his head. These men weren't here to talk. They were here for blood. The second gunshot was even closer. Silas felt the old mare stumble and cry out as a bullet grazed her flank. The tough old horse kept running, driven by pain and fear, but she was slowing. Behind them, Blake and his men were whooping and hollering like they were on a fox hunt, their powerful horses eating up the distance with every stride. Silas pulled his own pistol from its holster, his hand steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He twisted in his seat and fired once, not aiming to kill, but to scatter them, to buy a few precious seconds. The shot went wide, but it had the desired effect. The riders fanned out, their formation breaking for a moment. "Hold on!" he shouted to Min. He yanked the reins hard to the left, pulling the wagon off the main road and onto a narrow rocky trail that wound up into the hills outside of town. It was a gamble. The ground was rougher, more treacherous for the wagon, but it might just even the odds. The old mare was breathing hard, foam flecking her mouth, but she didn't falter. These ranch horses were bred for endurance, and she had more fight in her than her age suggested. The wagon bounced and rattled violently over the uneven terrain. Silas heard Min cry out as she was thrown hard against the side. Behind them, the riders were having trouble. Their sleek horses, bred for speed on flat ground, were struggling with the loose rocks and steep incline. Blake's horse stumbled, nearly throwing its rider, and another man had to pull up sharply as his mount shied away from a steep drop. But they were still coming. They were furious now, their hunt turning into a frustrating chore, which only made them more dangerous. Up ahead, Silas spotted an outcropping of rocks, a place where the trail narrowed to a tight bottleneck between 2 massive boulders. If he could just get the wagon through there, the riders would be forced to come at them one at a time. It was their only chance. The wheels of the wagon scraped against the rocks with a deafening screech, with only inches to spare on either side. As soon as they were through, Silas hauled back on the reins, pulling the panting mare to a stop. He grabbed his rifle from its scabbard and jumped down. "Stay down!" he yelled to Min, taking cover behind one of the boulders. Blake Jennings appeared at the mouth of the narrow passage, his horse skittish, his face flushed with rage and exertion. "You can't run forever, Ward. Send out the girl, and we might just let you ride away in one piece." "Go to hell, Jennings," Silas called back, leveling his rifle. Blake's response was another gunshot. The bullet ricocheted off the rock near Silas's head, sending a spray of sharp stone chips into his face. Silas didn't flinch. He took a steadying breath, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. His aim was true. The bullet hit the ground right in front of Blake's horse. The animal reared up with a terrified scream, throwing the young man hard to the ground. The other riders immediately pulled back, their bravado vanishing now that this was no longer a one-sided fight. But Silas knew it was only a temporary reprieve. They wouldn't give up that easily. They would find another way around, or they would simply wait for reinforcements from town. That's when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. More hoofbeats, but these were coming from ahead of them, from further up the trail. Blake's men hadn't been the only ones to leave town. Someone else, smarter and more patient, had taken a different route. They had circled around. They had cut off their only escape. They were trapped. The rocky outcropping that had been their salvation was now their prison. The sun was beginning to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody streaks of red and orange. Silas looked at Min, huddled and terrified in the back of the wagon, and realized with a sickening finality that this was very likely where their story ended. But if he was going down, he was going down on his own terms. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded smudged piece of paper the auctioneer had given him, the bill of sale, a document of pure evil. With hands that weren't quite steady, he tore it into small pieces. Then he held them up and let the evening wind catch them, scattering them like dead leaves across the rocky ground. "What you do?" Min whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the paper fragments disappear into the twilight. "Setting you free," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "Really free. No papers, no ownership. From this moment on, you are your own person." It was a symbolic gesture, maybe a foolish one. Freedom wouldn't mean much if they were both dead in the next 10 minutes. The riders from up the trail were getting closer. He could hear their horses picking their way down the rocky path. Below, Blake was back on his feet, his face a mask of fury, shouting orders to his men as they prepared for another assault. They were caught in a vice. And then a new voice rang out, sharp and clear and full of authority, echoing across the rocks. "That's far enough, boys." Silas looked up, his heart leaping into his throat. Riding hard from the direction of town, silhouetted against the dying sun, were Marshal Tucker and 3 deputies. The marshal had his gun drawn, his face set in hard, uncompromising lines. The riders who had been coming down the trail suddenly reined in their horses, finding themselves caught between Tucker's posse and the rocky fortress where Silas was holed up. Below, Blake's men froze, their attack sputtering out before it could even begin. "Marshal!" Blake called out, his voice strained as he tried to sound reasonable. "We're just trying to stop a crime here. Ward stole that property fair and square." "Funny thing about that auction," Tucker called back, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "I sent a wire to the federal marshal in the next county. Turns out the men running it were wanted for similar activities in 3 other territories, which means they had no legal right to sell anything or anyone." He spurred his horse a little closer, his gun never wavering. "And participating in human trafficking? That's a federal crime, Blake. A crime that comes with a long, long stay in a federal prison." The blood drained from Blake's face. Around him, his companions exchanged nervous, panicked glances. The righteous mob mentality that had propelled them this far evaporated in an instant. What had seemed like a fun afternoon of bullying an old man and a helpless girl was suddenly looking like a one-way ticket to a hangman's noose. "Now," Tucker continued, his voice like chips of ice, "I suggest you and your friends ride back to town and forget this whole unfortunate business ever happened. Before I decide, I need to start taking official statements about who knew what and when." One by one, Blake's men began to back away. They had signed up for a lynching, not for federal prison. They turned their horses and rode off, disappearing back down the trail without a backward glance. Within moments, only Blake remained, his face twisted with a toxic mix of humiliation and impotent rage. "This isn't over, Ward," he spat, his voice cracking. "Yes," Tucker said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is, because I'm making it over. And from this point forward, anyone who so much as looks at these folks the wrong way will have to answer to me. Personally." Blake glared at them all for a long, hate-filled moment. Then he yanked his horse's head around and galloped away, his angry shouts swallowed by the vast, empty landscape. The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the wind whistling through the rocks. Tucker dismounted and walked over to where Silas was helping a trembling Min down from the wagon. "You two all right?" the marshal asked, his stern expression finally softening. Silas nodded, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. "Thanks to you, Marshal. I don't know what would have happened." "Well," Tucker said with a slight wry smile, "Mrs. Henderson sent word about which way you'd gone. Figured you might need a hand." He turned his kind eyes to Min. "Miss, you're safe now, and you're free. No one owns you. And as long as I'm the law in this territory, no one has the right to lay a hand on you." Min looked from Tucker's honest face to Silas's weary one, and then for the first time since he had seen her on that horrible auction block, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, fragile thing, like a new flower pushing its way up through frozen ground, but it was real. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and pain. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice still quiet, but with a new note of hope in it. Silas looked out across the vast rolling hills that stretched toward his distant ranch. It was a big place, too big for one lonely man. There was plenty of room for someone who needed a safe harbor, a new beginning, a place to figure out what came next. "Now," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he didn't recognize. "We go home." But as they started the long, slow journey to the ranch, with Tucker and his deputies providing a silent escort, Silas couldn't shake a deep, unsettling feeling. This felt too easy. Men like Cord Jennings and his son didn't just give up. They didn't just swallow their pride and walk away. Their hatred was a living, breathing thing. It wouldn't just fade into the sunset. And there was something else bothering him. The man in the black coat at the auction. The one who had bid $3. He hadn't been with Blake's mob. He had simply vanished. Who was he? And why had he wanted Min so badly? Not with the brutish lust of the others, but with a cold, calculating purpose. Silas had a terrible feeling that he hadn't just bought a girl for $3.50. He had stumbled into the middle of a war he didn't understand. And the battle they had just survived wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. The first few weeks at the ranch were quiet, deceptively quiet. Silas and Min fell into a simple, unspoken routine. He would tend to the ranch, mending fences, caring for the livestock, doing the backbreaking work that had defined his entire life. Min, in turn, transformed the small, neglected patch of land behind the cabin. She had a gift. Her hands, though small, seemed to coax life from the dry, stubborn soil. She planted seeds she had carefully carried with her, strange vegetables and herbs Silas had never seen before. They rarely spoke. The language barrier was a high wall between them, but they found other ways to communicate. A shared meal at the end of a long day, a nod of respect, a small, grateful smile. Silas began to see the person who had been buried beneath all that fear. He saw her intelligence in the clever way she designed her garden beds to conserve water. He saw her strength in the tireless way she worked from sunrise to sunset. He saw her kindness in the gentle way she treated the ranch animals. He learned she was a brilliant cook, able to turn the simplest ingredients, vegetables from her garden, a rabbit he might catch, into meals that exploded with flavors he'd never imagined. And slowly, piece by piece, he started to learn her story. She would point to a word in an old book he owned, and he would say the English word. She would repeat it, her pronunciation careful, until she got it right. He learned she was from a province in the south of China. He learned her family were farmers, just like him. And he learned how she had been taken, stolen from her home by men who had promised her work in America. The journey had been a nightmare, ending at that disgusting auction in Copper Falls. But there was a part of her story she kept hidden, a shadow in her eyes that appeared whenever he asked about the man in the black coat. When Silas described him, her face would go pale, and she would fall silent, retreating back into the shell he had first seen her in. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Silas decided to push. "Min," he said gently, "the man at the auction, the one in the black coat, who was he?" She flinched, her eyes darting toward the dark horizon, as if she expected him to appear there. She shook her head, whispering a single word in Chinese, a word he didn't understand. "He is why they want me," she finally said in broken English. "Not because I am Chinese, because of what I carry." Before Silas could ask what she meant, she stood up and went inside the cabin. She returned a moment later with a small, silk-wrapped bundle he had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was not a weapon or gold or anything he could have expected. It was an intricately carved wooden seal, a chop, bearing a complex Chinese character, and a small, rolled-up piece of rice paper covered in elegant calligraphy. "My father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He gave me. He say, keep safe. Never lose." Silas looked at the strange objects, a deep sense of unease washing over him. This was more than just a family heirloom. This was the reason she had been hunted. This was the secret she had been protecting. The quiet was shattered the next morning. Silas was down by the creek checking his water lines when he heard it. A single sharp rifle shot echoing from the direction of the cabin. His blood ran cold. He dropped his tools and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the clearing and saw 3 men on horseback. They weren't Blake's thuggish friends. These were different, hard-faced professional men, and with them, sitting calmly on a sleek black horse, was the man from the auction, the man in the black coat. Min was standing on the porch holding Silas's old rifle. The barrel was still smoking. One of the riders was clutching his arm, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve. She had shot one of them. The man in the black coat dismounted. He moved with a calm, predatory grace. He ignored Silas completely, his eyes fixed on Min. "You have been a surprising amount of trouble, little sparrow," he said, his English perfect, with a faint, unplaceable accent. "My employer is growing impatient. Give me the seal, and I will be merciful. I will only kill the old man." The coldness of the threat was absolute. This wasn't about racism or mob justice. This was business. "Who are you?" Silas demanded, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. The man finally turned his chilling gaze on Silas. "My name is of no consequence. I am merely an agent for a man who gets what he wants. A man named Mr. Chen." He looked back at Min. "Your father made a deal with Mr. Chen. A deal for the land this entire territory is built on. A deal he sealed with his chop. Your father broke that deal. And now, Mr. Chen is here to collect." Silas stared, his mind reeling. The land? This wasn't about Min. It was about everything. The ranches, the mines, the town itself. "The railroad," Silas breathed, the pieces finally clicking into place. The railroad was coming through. Everyone knew it. Land values were about to skyrocket. Whoever controlled the original deeds would control everything. "Precisely," the man in black said with a thin smile. "The original Spanish land grants were purchased by Min's father's trading company years ago. A speculative investment. He sold them to Mr. Chen, a business rival, but kept the official seal required to transfer the deeds. Without that seal, the papers Mr. Chen holds are worthless. Min is the only one who knows where it is." He gestured to the rifle in her hands. "Or perhaps she is foolish enough to carry it with her." Suddenly, the whole ugly affair made a terrifying kind of sense. The auction wasn't about selling a girl for labor or pleasure. It was a trap. A way for Chen's men to acquire Min quietly, without raising suspicion. They knew she had the seal, and they had tracked her all the way to Copper Falls. Silas's impulsive bid hadn't saved her. It had just royally screwed up their plan. "You're not taking her," Silas said, drawing his pistol, "and you're not taking anything from this ranch." The man in black sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I was afraid you would be unreasonable." He gave a slight nod to his 2 uninjured men. They raised their rifles. But before they could fire, another shot rang out, this one from the rocky ridge overlooking the ranch. One of the riders cried out and tumbled from his saddle, clutching his leg. Silas and the man in black both spun around. Standing on the ridge, rifle in hand, was Marshall Tucker. "Seems you boys are a long way from home," Tucker called down, his voice calm and steady. "And you're trespassing on private property." The man in black stared up at the marshal, his cold composure finally cracking. He hadn't expected the law to intervene so far out of town. He looked at Silas, then at Min, then back at the marshal on the ridge. He was outnumbered, for now. With a look of pure venom, he gestured for his remaining man to help the injured one. Without another word, they mounted their horses and galloped away, disappearing into the vast landscape. The immediate danger was over, but the silence they left behind was more terrifying than the gunshots. Tucker made his way down to the cabin. His face was grim. "Silas, you've stumbled into something bigger than you can possibly imagine," he said, his eyes on the small wooden seal Min was now holding. "Mr. Chen is not a man you want as an enemy. He's the head of the San Francisco Tong. He has spies everywhere. The men in this town, men like Cord Jennings, they're already on his payroll. They've been helping him search for this girl." It was a staggering revelation. The racism, the mob, it had all been a performance, a distraction orchestrated by Chen to help his men find Min, and to punish Silas for interfering. Jennings didn't care about the natural order. He cared about the money Chen was paying him. "How do you know all this?" Silas asked, his head spinning. Tucker's gaze was heavy with a history Silas had never known. "Because before I was the marshal of Copper Falls, I was a lawman in San Francisco. I spent 5 years trying to put Mr. Chen behind bars. I failed." He looked at Min. "Her father was my informant. He was trying to break away from Chen, to do something good with his fortune. He was going to sign the land over to the people who lived on it, to men like you, Silas. Chen had him murdered before he could." The truth was a devastating blow. Min's father hadn't been a criminal. He had been a hero, trying to right a wrong, and he had entrusted his daughter with the key to his legacy. "So what do we do now?" "Ah," Silas asked, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. "Chen won't give up," Tucker said. "He'll be back, and he'll bring more men. A lot more. This ranch, it's not a fortress, Silas. It's a coffin." He looked from the ranch house to the distant lights of Copper Falls. "There's only one way to end this. We have to beat Chen at his own game. We have to use that seal to register the deeds in the right hands before he can get his." It was a suicide mission. They would have to ride back into Copper Falls, back into the town that was completely controlled by their enemy. They would have to get to the land registrar's office, with Chen's hired guns and Jennings's paid-off thugs hunting them every step of the way. But as Silas looked at Min, at the fierce, determined set of her jaw, he knew they had no other choice. She was no longer just a victim he had saved. She was the keeper of her father's legacy. And he had, by some strange twist of fate, become its guardian. "All right," Silas said, taking a deep breath. "When do we ride?" The plan was desperate, bordering on insane. Tucker would ride back into town and create a distraction, drawing Chen's men and Jennings's posse to the south end of town, with a false report of a gold strike. While they were occupied, Silas and Min would sneak in from the north, make their way to the land office, use the seal to file the documents Tucker had prepared. Documents that would sign the land grants over to a trust for the citizens of the territory, and get out before anyone was the wiser. It was a plan with 1,000 things that could go wrong. They rode under the cover of darkness, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The 10-mile journey to town was a nerve-wracking ordeal. Every rustle of leaves, every coyote's howl, sounded like an approaching enemy. Min rode behind Silas on his horse, her small arms wrapped tightly around his waist. He could feel her trembling, but he could also feel the steel in her spine. She was no longer the terrified child from the auction. She was a warrior. As they neared the edge of town, they could see the flickering lights of torches and hear the distant shouts of men. Tucker's distraction was working. A large part of the town's men had ridden out south, chasing the phantom glimmer of gold. They dismounted, tying their horse in a grove of trees, and proceeded on foot, sticking to the shadows of the back alleys. The town was eerily quiet. The few people left were locked inside their homes, afraid of the violence that had gripped Copper Falls. They moved like ghosts, past the back of the saloon, past the darkened mercantile, until they reached the small, unassuming building with the words Land Registrar painted on the window. The door was locked. Silas pulled a lockpick from his saddlebag, a skill he'd learned in a past he preferred not to talk about, and went to work. The lock clicked open with a soft metallic snap. They slipped inside, plunging the room into darkness as they closed the door behind them. Silas lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. The office was filled with towering shelves of dusty books and scrolls. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and ink. "The territorial grants," Silas whispered. "They should be in the main ledger." Min, who could read the formal characters far better than he could, immediately went to the largest book on the main desk. Her fingers flew across the pages, her eyes scanning the columns of text. After a tense minute, she nodded, pointing to a specific section. Silas pulled out the documents Tucker had prepared. They were pre-filled, legally sound transfers of ownership. All they needed was the official seal to make them binding. Min unwrapped the silk bundle. She took the wooden chop, inked it on a pad from the desk, and with a steady hand, pressed it firmly onto the bottom of each document. The sharp red character stood out against the paper, a symbol of defiance, a mark of justice. They had done it. Just as Silas was placing the ledger back on the shelf, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. Footsteps on the wooden boardwalk outside. They weren't the stumbling, drunken footsteps of a late-night wanderer. They were slow, deliberate, and heading directly for the office door. Silas immediately doused the lantern, plunging them back into absolute darkness. He drew his pistol, pulling Min behind him. They stood there frozen, barely breathing, as the footsteps stopped right in front of the door. The doorknob began to turn. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the faint moonlight from the street. It wasn't the man in black. It wasn't Cord Jennings. It was Mrs. Henderson. She was holding a shotgun, and her face, illuminated for a moment as she lit a match, was a mask of cold fury. "I knew you'd come here," she said, her voice low and hard, nothing like the kindly old woman he remembered. "Tucker is a fool. He thinks he can fight the inevitable, but Mr. Chen always wins." Silas was stunned into silence. Mrs. Henderson? The kind woman who had given them food, who had helped them escape? "He pays well," she said, as if reading his mind. "Better than running a boarding house for ungrateful minors." She had been a spy for Chen all along. Her kindness had been an act. She had been the one to tell Chen's men where his ranch was. "You won't get away with this," Silas growled, his gun still trained on her. "Oh, I think I will," she said with a chilling smile. "Because you see, I'm not alone." From the shadows behind her, two more figures emerged. Cord Jennings and his son, Blake. Their faces were grim, their guns already drawn. They had been waiting. The gold strike distraction had been a feint, a trick to lure Tucker away and leave Silas and Min vulnerable. And then the man in the black coat stepped into the room, a smug, triumphant look on his face. "A valiant effort, Mr. Ward," he said smoothly. "Truly. But now it is over. Give me the seal in the newly stamped documents." They were trapped, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. It was over. But then Silas saw something, a flicker of movement in the reflection of the window glass. Someone was in the alley behind the office. Just as the man in black stepped forward to take the papers, the back window of the office shattered inwards. Marshall Tucker burst through, his face a mask of grim determination. He hadn't fallen for the feint. "Drop your weapons," Tucker roared. For a heartbeat, the room was a frozen tableau of shock and indecision. Blake Jennings, young and reckless, reacted first. He swung his gun toward Tucker, but before he could fire, another gunshot exploded in the confined space. It wasn't from Tucker. It was from his father. Cord Jennings shot his own son. Blake crumpled to the ground, a look of utter disbelief on his face, clutching a wound in his shoulder. Everyone stared at Cord, stunned. "I won't let him hang for this," Cord said, his voice ragged with anguish. "I made a deal with Chen, not him." He turned his gun on the man in black. "My deal is over." The man in black, for the first time, looked genuinely surprised. Before he could react, Mrs. Henderson lunged at him, not with a shotgun, but with a small, wicked-looking knife she had pulled from her dress. She screamed a string of words in Chinese, a sound of pure, primal rage. The man in black shoved her back, but not before her knife slashed across his arm. In that moment of chaos, Tucker acted. He fired twice. The first shot took Mrs. Henderson in the shoulder, sending her sprawling. The second hit the man in black square in the chest. He staggered backward, a look of astonishment on his face, before collapsing in a heap. It was over in 5 seconds of shocking, brutal violence. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Blake's pained groans. Cord Jennings dropped his gun and fell to his knees beside his son, his face a wreck of despair. He had aligned himself with a monster, and it had cost him everything. Later, as the sun began to rise over a town that would never be the same, Tucker explained the final pieces of the puzzle. He had suspected a leak, someone feeding Chen information. He had deliberately fed Mrs. Henderson the false information about the gold strike, knowing she would pass it along. He had been waiting in the alley the whole time. And Mrs. Henderson? Her real name was Lynn, and she was the sister of Mr. Chen's rival, the one he had murdered years ago. She had been working for Chen, yes, but only to get close enough to kill him or his top agents. Her rage, her attack, had been one of pure vengeance. 6 months later, the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. With the deeds legally secured in a territorial trust, Mr. Chen's power in Copper Falls was broken. Faced with federal charges and the collapse of his plans, his empire began to crumble. Cord Jennings, having turned state's evidence, was serving a short prison sentence, while his son recovered, hopefully having learned a hard lesson about the true cost of greed. And at the ranch, life had found a new, peaceful rhythm. Min, no longer a frightened girl but a confident young woman, ran the most successful vegetable garden in 3 counties. She sold her produce to the markets in town, earning the respect of the very people who had once scorned her. With the help of Marshall Tucker, Silas had deeded half of the ranch over to her, making her the first Chinese woman to own land in the territory. On quiet evenings, they would still sit on the porch, watching the sunset, the comfortable silence between them more meaningful than any words. They would sometimes talk about that day in Copper Falls, the day that 3 crumpled dollar bills and 50 cents in charity had unraveled a web of conspiracy and changed 2 lives forever. The bill of sale was long gone, scattered to the wind on a rocky hillside. But the bond that had been forged in the fires of that day, a bond of courage, respect, and unlikely friendship, was stronger than any legal document. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most decent thing a person can do is the thing that makes no sense at all. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost, then hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because we have a lot more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. And click on the video you see on the screen right now, because the next story is about a lighthouse keeper who discovered a secret in the fog so terrifying, it was never meant for human eyes. Trust me, you have to see it to believe it. Click it now.